news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and religious recovery consultant. Isaiah Bell is a Canadian tenor, writer, composer, and artist who grew up in Canada in an evangelical cult. I recently had the opportunity to attend his one-man cabaret-style opera called The Book of My Shames, in which he guides the audience through the permutations of a life defined by what it's missing, or as he calls it, the story of a whole. Isaiah describes The Book of My Shames this way. I'm a good and happy modern gay, thanks very much, sufficiently erudite, reasonably camp, ambitious, polite. But there's this other me that's at odds with all that, this tender part that has been left behind in the dark. Shame maintains the gap between us. So I'm reaching out. This is my Rosetta Stone between two halves of a broken heart. Growing up fundy is challenging at the best of times, but incredibly tough for those who are members of the two-spirit LGBTQ plus community. I loved watching The Book of My Shames, and I'm delighted that Isaiah took time out of his busy performance schedule to join me today. Welcome, Isaiah Bell.
Thanks so much for having me, Janice. This is great.
So I saw you in Kelowna. That's where I live in British Columbia. And I couldn't believe that we actually were able to have someone of your talent and renown come to Kelowna to perform this important piece that you wrote and that you star in. It was really great. I hope you enjoy doing it as much as I enjoyed watching it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, actually, so this is my second time performing the piece at Opera Kelowna, and I've had a long-standing relationship with Rosemary Thompson, who's the artistic director at Opera Kelowna. And there is a sense, I know that Kelowna can be a conservative place, but that organization really has a real dedication to sort of trying to open people's minds, not just to the different kinds of forms of opera, but just to the different ways that people live. And every time I come to work with them, I feel a sense of like sort of creative community and like a really sort of like a life force filled experience.
Wonderful. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I wonder if you would, pardon me, start us off with telling us a little bit about your background, how you grew up. I know there was religion, fundamentalism involved quite a bit there, and that was in Canada as well?
Yes. So my parents met in the 70s in a branch of this. Well, the group is called The Move. I'm not sure if you've heard of it or if you know anyone from it, but it was a group of people, as far as I understand, who Americans mostly, who in the 70s, they followed this charismatic figure, Sam Fife, out of America to sort of often the wilderness areas of Canada, where the place I was born was in Northern Ontario, outside Thunder Bay. And then the place I grew up was in Northern BC, outside Fort St. John. And these people were trying to sort of flee the sort of, the coming apocalypse as they saw it, and to live somewhere where they could live only the way they wanted to, and they didn't have to get any input from anyone else who wasn't part of the network. So we lived, so we moved from a farm that I was born on to another farm, and the whole idea was that you were away from, as we call it, the world, and you were just like, we called each other brother and sister, and it wasn't, I mean, when we call it a cult, it wasn't the most extreme cult I've ever heard of, but it certainly, when you look up what a cult is, it certainly fell into the definition of a cult, which is, a charismatic leader who actually died before I was born, but the cult continued for a number of decades afterwards. And, the elements of control and the elements of shame, which of course is what a lot of my work is about now. And so, I grew up, we left when I was 11, and it's interesting because I have 5 siblings. There's 6 of us in total, and it's interesting to see, my oldest sibling was born in 1980, and my youngest sibling was born in 1997, just after we left. So it's interesting to see the ways that their personalities and their relationship to religion have been affected by how long they were in the community, and the relationship to themselves. It's almost a sort of scientific control group, kind of the way that people, and not always in the ways that you'd think necessarily, like often quite sort of against how you'd expect. But yeah, so I left when we were 11, and my parents are still religious, and but we distanced ourselves from that organization. There was a they discovered, there was a pedophile on the farm who had been sort of, because of course with a lot of these situations there's a lot of sense of well, in ours specifically, there's a sense that because it's a community, all adults sort of have control and power over all children, kind of, and so this guy had sort of unfettered access to a lot of the young boys on the farm, and so when my parents found this out, they went to the elders of the community, who of course are these people, as in most of these situations, who sort of get their information directly from God and then tell you what God tells you have to do, and said, we're not happy with the way that our children are, like, we want more control over the way that our children are taken care of, and who they hang out with, and this kind of stuff. And the elders told them, well, if you're not happy with the way we do things here, you have 2 weeks to leave. And so they my mother had never lived. I mean, she moved to sorry, there's the mailman just came. My mother had moved there with her family when she was 17. So she'd never lived outside. Just give me a second. Sorry.
No problem.
See if that's settled down there. They're very excitable creatures. My mother had never lived outside of this community as an adult, this network of farms as an adult. And my dad had come after he'd had experience with, he'd been in seminary and had been going to be a Jesuit priest. And then right before he took the vows, he decided, the system was too hypocritical. And so he became a hippie, and he traveled around and did a lot of drugs, and sort of came out of that sort of back to religion. So for him, it was sort of a mature choice in his life, and a positive choice in his life. And his memories of it are much more positive than the people, the rest of the family. But my mother was sort of never had a chance to choose it for herself. And, but both of them had been in the communities for 20 years and didn't have jobs or connections outside of the communities. And in 2 weeks had to sort of totally reform their lives.
Wow.
And start from the bottom. And, so that, my teen years are very much defined by like this sort of clash of civilizations, because of course, even though we were an hour away from people who were living regular modern lives in a Canadian city, I really feel like I grew up in a different culture. Like there was huge culture clash when I was in my early teen years, just trying to understand like what was this world I was coming into, that according to the way that I'd been taught. I mean, it wasn't like I'd never been to town. Like we would go to town to get groceries once every couple of weeks, and we would travel to the States and to Ontario to visit my extended family, who were also religious, but not all of them were in the same network of farms. But so I really had this idea that the world was like, well, I always think of it as like sort of like a Mad Max fantasy of like, just sort of selfishness and evil. And I mean, imagine my surprise when I realized that maybe evil was not only contained in the outside world.
Yes. Well, how many folks lived on the farm where you lived? Like, what was the community size there in your group?
So I'm not quite sure. I mean, I was a kid, and so my memories of it are all quite distorted. But I think on our particular farm, it varied. People came and went. Especially throughout the network, people would go to different farms. Like if you had trouble on one, you might go to the other, which is what happened to this guy, this pedophile. He just sort of got, maybe had been shuttled here from another farm, as often happens in these situations. But I think on ours, maybe it was probably between like 30 and 40, maybe on our farm. And then we lived in an area where there was a network of maybe 3 or 4 of these other farms, like within an hour or two drive. So it was a whole community, and we would go to the other farms to have meetings. And
What
And
was school like?
well, we had a little sort of 2-room schoolhouse where we would be taking a sort of um, correspondence curriculum that was taught by a woman who lived on the farm. And there was one person basically in each grade. There was like sort of 5 of us going to school at the time, and it was it was an American religious curriculum that they were teaching us. And yeah, actually, the interesting thing is that my parents are sort of very literate people and very intelligent and very well read. And I when I came into the world of sort of the not farm, I realized how much sort of better prepared I was in some ways in terms of writing and reading, and I know that's not with a lot of these things. The withholding education is a big part of it, but that wasn't my experience in terms of like basic skills. I mean, there was obviously a lot of kinds of education that were withheld, but in terms of just like basic educational things, writing and reading and math and stuff, I was sort of better off than some of my peers when I came into proper school outside.
Wow. And so, were you in your early teens then? I think, did you say you were 11 when you guys left?
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So just getting ready to start what would have been junior high, maybe when you're like 13 or something.
Yes, exactly. So I did grades 6 and 7 by correspondence because my parents weren't quite sure what to do with us. It was just the beginning of the school year when we left, and so we did correspondence courses, and my mother sort of taught us. And we're all a bit ADHD, my family, and so that wasn't very successful. And so then grades 8 and 9, I went to a Christian school, which was maybe 150 kids from grades 8 to 12 in this Christian school, which was yeah. I mean, the one of the themes here is with me is that the situations that are supposed to protect you more end up being the more traumatizing. And then that was really the worst time, was going and meeting these like sort of modern kids, but they're Christian kids, or they're in Christian school, and it's a very small sort of hothouse environment. And if you're different, there's not as many options for you to find someone who's also different because there's so few kids in the school. So that was very difficult. That was really some of the bumpiest years of my life. And then from 10 to 12, I just went to a regular high school. I had to sort of bully my parents into letting me in. They made me promise, okay, well, you got to study the Bible every day if you're going to go out to this like den of sin. And instead I sort of studied drama textbooks. And
did you hollow out the Bible and stick your drama textbooks inside there so they couldn't tell if they walked into the room?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that, and I would be interested to hear if this is something that other people have had this experience. People who go into these situations often go in because they're not very good at controlling their own lives and taking. So you want to sort of, there's this compulsive need to pass control and responsibility off to someone else, even if it's going to be abusive, because your sense of structuring within yourself is not strong. And so when we left the farm, obviously there's a lot of sort of rigidity still inside of all of us, but the sense of structure and control was not there at all, because that had been provided entirely externally. So the scaffolding, when it was taken away, we sort of fell into a heap. And so my parents weren't very adept at sort of providing structure for us. And so, I mean, that resolve to study the Bible quickly went out the window, and I just did whatever I wanted, which has its ups and downs. But I mean, as you know, in the show, there's a whole the show, The Book of My Shames, is based off of the actual book that is referred to is this sort of horrific journal I made in high school art class with all my teen angst in it. And there's a part in it where I ripped out all the pages of the Bible that mentioned homosexuality and plastered a used condom over them. So that was my relationship to the Bible at the time.
So you've made this massive transition away from the only way you've ever known it, when you were in this really kind of isolated or insulated compound kind of structure. And then your parents are shocked because they were shocked to find out someone was abusing children on the farm, but then they were shocked to be told if they didn't like it, they had to leave within 2 weeks. They didn't have a lot of preparation to find a job or even find a place to live. So your folks are kind of in their own sudden grief process. And then all the kids, your parents are responsible for you, and you're kind of along for the ride. Whatever your parents decide, that's kind of the direction you're all going to be going in. And then I don't know if it was this way with the Christian school that they put you in, but around here, Christian schools, they pretty much start at kindergarten. It's going to be the same group of kids going all the way through to grade 12. And this is where it can be very difficult for outsiders to come at some point and have to break in there, grade 6 or 7 or whatever. These kids are already as thick as thieves, the ones that have been in there together. And here comes the outsider, and you just want to be accepted. You want to fit in, really, as we do. But it's very hard to make our way in there. And I imagine there were things that seemed that they did differently at that school than you were used to. Like your parents' cult was Bible-based.
Yes. Very, very, very. I mean, it had grown out of the American evangelical tradition, speaking in tongues, all this kind of stuff. And it's just one of these things where like that tradition wasn't extreme enough, wasn't fundamentalist enough. So they took it a step further and went away where there was no contact with the outside world, or almost no contact. And so it was, even though we had the Bible, there were very few cultural reference points for me. That was the difficult thing about making new friends, is that for one thing, I didn't know how to make new friends. We'd only just ever had the kids on the farm that we were on the farm with, and we were just sort of friends with them by default. And so I didn't know how to meet new people. I didn't know anything about the world. We didn't have, TV or videos or anything. I'd seen like one movie until the time when we left the farm. And I really just, and kids at that age are so much about just, sort of the pop culture and sort of what, and sort of your very specific understanding about the specific time that you live in. And I was like coming from another century. I mean, I remember going to summer camp, like a Christian summer camp, and I didn't have any pants that weren't like dress pants, because I don't know what I wore. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I wore mud boots most of the time, and so I don't know what I wore, but like I just didn't know how to dress. I didn't understand like just the very basic things about being a person. It was like I sort of came from another planet.
Wow. And so did your level of autonomy kind of explode? Did your parents did the rules become much more lax when they left and you were just living as a family in a regular city?
Yeah, they did. And my parents tried to sort of continue a sense of regulation and control, but as I said, they didn't have the skill at the time. They hadn't built up this sort of healthy relationship with that. It was either all control or no control. And so when I think about it now, I think that the dominant means of interacting with and controlling the kids was guilt more than anything else. And which is just sort of, I think about and talk about this a lot, and my relationship to understanding this has changed a lot in my adult life. But I think about the idea of boundaries, which is a concept. I mean, that's not a new concept to any of us, but in my actual experience, my sort of body experience of the idea of a boundary is very new to me. I'm 37, and in the last year or 2 years, I've sort of started to understand with my body what a boundary actually is. Because, I mean, as you read in that, in that intro where I say, I'm polite and I'm a regular Canadian gay, and I think I can sort of fly under the radar as a kind of regular person, because one of my most essential tactic that I developed in those years for living in the world was to be as sort of inoffensive and nice as possible, because it was clear. I tried for a while to do the sort of, freak chic thing where you sort of dressed wacky, because I couldn't figure out how other people dressed. And I knew I was so far out, I could never dress cool, because I knew people would sort of be able to spot that I was an imposter. So, but when I eventually managed to settle in and find my people, the way I did it was by being sort of nice and funny and inoffensive, and basically not having any boundary between me and other people, like sort of psychological or emotional or sort of energetic boundary. And instead just sort of trying to change the temperature of myself in order to adjust to the temperature of the room, and not having any sense of myself really experientially as my own entity, which is the commune thing, is that you're all sort of in this miasma. I think of it as like sort of a Stranger Things kind of like mush of bodies and heads and limbs that are all sort of interconnected, and there's no sense of yourself as an individual, and that's really essential to the commune mindset, I think.
Wow, and you really have just described something that I think is fairly common for those of us who grew up in fundamentalist homes, whether it's on a commune or just in a regular city town kind of setting. We aren't permitted to have boundaries because our parents and the elders, the teachers in the community, the pastors and priests, they must have constant access to us. It's like a cult of confession that we grow up in. And which, of course, then makes us ripe for predatory behavior, because we're not allowed, we don't even have language around expressing boundaries when we're children. And those are just such difficult concepts. And then, of course, it goes right along with codependency, which is baked into Christianity, I will say, especially fundamentalist aspects of it. And that has to do with difficulties with boundaries. And you mentioned landing in a place where, okay, I'm just going to be nice and I'll change my temperature to match the people around me. That is just so classic for codependency. And it's nothing but a coping mechanism that we develop because of the situations that we're in. We have to learn as children how to survive in this situation. So that is one way that we can do it. But then once we get older, we realize that's not the way we want to be. We recognize boundaries have validity. They're healthy.
Yeah, I was just saying to my husband yesterday, I kind of didn't understand that there was a way to put any kind of barrier between someone else that wasn't sort of fundamentally hostile. I always thought if you put something between yourself and someone else, that's a way that you're being rude to them, or that's a way that you're cutting them off. And I thought it was just basically bad, and I didn't understand there was a healthy way to do that. And he's, just living with him has kind of taught me that it's possible, and not only is it. I was reading a book the other day about a new definition of mind, and this guy, who was trying to find a conciliant way of a bunch of different disciplines, like neuropsychology, or neuroscience and psychology and anthropology, all these people to agree on what mind is, so in order to be able to figure out what mental health is. And one of the things he came up with was that mental health is defined by an integrated entity, which is something that where the different elements of you are differentiated but linked. So they each have their own sort of names and entities, and they're separate from each other. So they're not a big mass, but they're working together. And that's something that I thought either you're totally separate from something, and that's the true with, as you said, the different halves of a broken heart, like you mentioned in the intro, or it's this big mass, like you're all sort of in a big sort of continuous glob, and it's one or the other. And understanding that you can be like, I'm me and you're you, and you can be mad, and I don't have to feel those feelings. I can be empathetic or compassionate as much as I can be, but it doesn't have to be. I don't have to accept whatever you are throwing out. And it's mind blowing to me.
Beautiful, yes, and of course that all or nothing thinking that you're describing there is also par for the course when we grow up in fundamentalist homes, and when we are indoctrinated, particularly from childhood, before we have the ability to critically think or process, what we're being told. We just have to, it's a parent or an authority figure telling us this is true and you have to believe it. So in order for us to be safe, I'll believe it. And then it's the all or nothing. You're either, God doesn't want lukewarm believers. He'll spit them out of his mouth, all those different things that we heard growing up. And so we can leave fundamentalist religious beliefs, but that's not the same as leaving fundamentalist thinking. Our fundamentalist thinking can follow us and hang on for quite a long time until we become aware of it, and until we become more comfortable with the shades of gray that exist.
You're speaking to me so much. I mean, so since one thing that's interesting to me about all this is that, I, in my adult life, in my 30s, I've come to through singing and through having difficulties, because for me, singing has been the sort of litmus test for what's going on in my inner dynamic, because singing is all about this sort of union of opposite forces, tension and release and engagement and sort of letting go. And so if it's not working, I did all this kind of stuff to try to figure out, like, why is my singing in some situations, especially when I'm in front of other people, why does it sort of lock up sometimes and can't work? And so that was my pathway to discovering a lot of this, to just sort of figuring out a lot of stuff, because I wasn't interested in working on myself. I was interested in being a famous singer, and I think a lot of people who escape from a situation that is toxic, the way they want to fix themselves is by setting up an external self that's really a certain way. And so so that a lot of that work led me to meditation and a sort of pan Buddhist sort of way of looking at things. And that's that's been part of my journey. That's not sort of where I've ended up, but that's part of my experience. And it's been so interesting to come to, through a total back channel, come to a different relationship with spirituality, because for many people it's like anything spiritual or anything that's named in that way is totally broken, and broken for them forever. There's no way back, because the name is so tarnished. Mm-hmm. And so, but within all that, even with sort of these Buddhist ideas of we are all one, and ideas of accepting the world around you, I've noticed myself coming at it from a fundamentalist approach, because of course fundamentalist Buddhism is a thing too. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I know people who have been traumatized by a sort of fundamentalist Buddhist approach. It's different than fundamentalist Christianity. There are different problems, but fundamentalism can exist in any life. It doesn't even have to be religion, as you know.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so it's been so interesting. And even, I've been reading some self-help books that have, some stuff that has really helped me. Ideas of sort of facing the things that are difficult for you, and because coming from a very control heavy lifestyle, many years of my life have been sort of like I said about my parents, like reestablishing a sense of permissiveness, a sense of maybe a desire that I have maybe isn't bad. Maybe it's okay to give in to yourself. And so sort of going too far with that of everything's permissive, everything's okay. I have to always listen to my body and whatever I want, because that's the only way to sort of react against that really restrictive way of being. And then coming to a place where you're like, no, I'm 37 years old, and there's some ways I don't want to live, and I don't always want to be at the mercy of all my impulses, because that's not healthy either. Mm-hmm. And so trying to find these ways to dive into discomfort and to accept and celebrate the friction of life, so that you can have a healthy balance with yourself. And I find myself, I always have to catch myself. And you say, it takes a long time for you to leave that behind. In some ways, I think I may never leave behind some parts of myself that are a little bit fundamentalist, and that's just part of my body and part of who I am. Mm-hmm. And I notice, and I always have to just keep that in my awareness, that whatever I do, whatever thing I discover, whatever way my life goes, there's always going to be a little part of me probably that comes at it from a kind of black and white approach. And that's just who I am. That's just part of who I am and what this body is,
Right. Oh, wow. That's so true. I know for myself, I was a very devout believer, evangelical, speaking in tongues, all these things, and married a man who became a pastor, homeschooled our children, this sort of thing. And I was born into it. But then I liken it to a beach ball that's being held beneath the water for too long. You can feel the pressure mounting. You take your hands off and, oh my gosh, it's just a great big mess, water spraying everywhere. And that's kind of what my deconversion was like. Very messy. My children had a front row seat to that gong show. It was, pretty shocking for everybody. And then I went through a phase of denying myself nothing, literally. If I want to try it, if it's not going to hurt someone else, I'm going to try it, whatever it is. So I kind of swung the pendulum way far the other direction. And now I really work more at trying to find and stay on that elusive middle ground when I can. And it's so hard because I was primed, as you were, for fundamentalism. And we can have a fundamentalist mindset in politics, nutrition, ecology. Because we're human, we really gravitate towards extremes. So that's very interesting.
In a way, it's much easier.
Yeah.
It's much easier to just think of things simply. And just like, this is right, this is wrong, and you put a word to it. I mean, even though the whole idea of the word in Christianity, the word is like, that's the truth, and there's no deviation. And in a way, it's not that it's weak, or that's not the right way to think about it, but it's much easier for our little brains to have a hard line and to think that that's strength, is to always adhere, rather than this sort of more flexible strength and inner leadership and outer leadership. And I mean, the whole Rumspringa idea, like the Amish thing of leaving and being like, sure, do whatever you want for a year and see how you feel at the end of that year. And of course, you're going to feel terrible. You smoked a whole packet of cigarettes and now you think, oh, I never want to do that again. So I mean, I think famously, those kids that do that almost always return, because they think, well, that was hellish. If that's what living in the world is, where people could do whatever they want, and they're miserable and sick, and at the end of it, like that's not good. So I'm going to go back, of course. But even that is part of that mindset of, well, it's either this or this, and it's never either this or this. And that's the thing that's hardest for a fundamentalist mindset to come to terms with.
So true. So, would you say you were an earnest believer for a time of your life? Like, did you believe in childhood and your teen years, or was it always hard for you to believe?
Well, that's such an interesting question, because I mean, as a kid, that almost isn't terminology that speaks to me in some way, because you believe something in the sense that when I think of beliefs, I think of something that you're like, when a belief is a thing, a belief is an entity. A belief is like a psychological entity. So these are my beliefs. This is what I believe. And that seems like a very adult thing to me. And as a kid, that's simply the truth. That's simply the world you live in. And so it wasn't like, my brother was a very doubting person. He's 4 years older than me, and he was very much like, this is all bullshit, everything's bad, and I kind of don't know how to answer that question, because I'm so sorry about this, the dogs.
That's okay.
That's part of my experience in this house, is a lot of noise. As a kid, there were some things that I knew weren't right, but I determined that the ways that I was going to get by was flying under the radar, rather than being a tall poppy and standing up and fighting back. And that's always been the way that I've been for my whole life. And I think that as a kid, I had an instinctive sense that I was not part of it, that I had an instinctive sense that there was something about me. So I guess, in answer to your question, I would say that I was never truly in it in the way that some other people were, because there was always a part of me. I think the way that I fought back, and I think this probably resonates with a lot of people who are in the situation, either you're totally in it and you're totally one with it, or there's a little part of you, and I think maybe introverts and people who are the nicest and people who are the most sort of deferential often have this, and the very core of them is something that is just your own private way of reacting, and your own private way of keeping something just for yourself. And for me, I mean, there's a sort of masochistic element to that, of sometimes the only way that you can fight back against this thing when there are no boundaries is by punishing yourself. Because if you don't see yourself really as separate, the only way to keep yourself separate or the only way to fight back against this glob that you're part of is to punish a part of yourself, which is the only thing that you have control over. And I will say that it wasn't difficult for me to distance myself from the religious part of things, in terms of my psychological, my mental understanding of things. I think I easily drifted away. And it took a while for me, the idea of hell and the idea of being gay and all of that, it took a while for me to actually think, oh no, I truly, truly don't believe in hell. like that took maybe into my 20s. And because I was surprised, I think, in my late teens and early 20s to think like, oh, it's still in the back of my head. I still kind of think about that as a thing. And I think I truly, truly don't believe that now. But but many of the other things, maybe because of having a brother who was really, the way that he fought back was really forward, was really, no, this is not okay. This is not good. And we were very close. And so seeing that, I think, gave me a little perspective. So I always had a sense, even though I was swimming in this world and there were many things that I didn't question at all, as I said, I think that there was always, I don't think I was one of the ones who ever, it wasn't, when you talk about divorcing religion, it wasn't difficult for me to drift away when that became naturally available.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, how did being gay factor into all of this? Like when did that recognition come about for you? And then, I mean, if you were still in school, did you feel you were having to hide it from other people, from your parents, from your siblings? How did that all go?
Yeah, this is so interesting because, this show that I do, The Book of My Shames, it's sort of billed as queer theater, and we talk about that a lot, and a lot of the interviews that we do, are around like sort of approaching it as if it's because it's all about self-acceptance or whatever, and so people kind of approach it from that angle. And I think, like I said about my siblings, you'd be surprised how the different exposure, the different amounts of exposure to the community, the ways that manifests are surprising. My relationship to the whole coming out thing, not to underplay it, but I think might be surprising too, because because I had this part of myself that was always my own. For a long time, I think I had the idea in my mind that I was actually at peace with the inner. Once of course, there was a lot of time in my early teen years of when I sort of made the realization. I remember looking in the mirror one day when I was like 13 or 14 and being like, oh no, I didn't realize that those things and those thoughts that I had and those feelings that I had, I didn't realize that's what this was. And now that I put a name to it, there was this wave of sort of dread and self-loathing about that. But I think I came to terms with it, at least mentally, in the first few years of that. And I came out when I was 17. I was at a musical theater summer camp, I think, as I mentioned in the show. And I came out to a girl there. And for me, the difficulty wasn't accepting it on a mental level on the inside. The difficulty was the idea of, I lived in a conservative small town, and the idea was the external thing. So that's what I think it might be surprising to some people. People talk about, I didn't even realize I was gay until I divorced my wife at 46 or whatever. And for me, I never understood that because I've always known in some way as very, very early, and came to, at least mentally, not necessarily somatically and experientially, but came to an acceptance of it pretty young. And because I think I had that slight distance from the world around me anyway. And so my inner life, and this is an essential part of the Book of My Shames and my whole relationship to shame, is that my inner life was over here and my outer life was way over here. And so my inner life could be pretty advanced in some way in terms of my relationship to gayness. And then my outer life was over here. And I didn't realize that just because I'd accepted it on the inside didn't mean I'd really accepted it. You have to integrate the different parts of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, it was, I think another element of it is that if you already hate yourself, and if you already see yourself as fundamentally sort of unacceptable or unlovable, it's not much of a jump to add another label to that, So, mm-hmm. So one of the elements of this that I think might surprise people when we talk about shame and everything is that even in the Book of My Shames, the shames that I'm talking about, most of them isn't mostly gay shame. Like, of course, that was an element of, walking around the small town that I lived in and having things screamed at me out of car windows and stuff like that. That was certainly a part of it. But that was more about me being afraid of physical violence rather than taking that on in some way or internally, at least mentally. And it really actually hasn't been till my 30s, like really, again, like in the last year or two, there's an interesting singing, as I said, is always a metaphor for this stuff because singing is so physical and requires your whole being, it's been so interesting to come to something as a result of singing and then realize that applies to my personal life or vice versa. come to something in my personal life and then it goes to my singing. There's this thing where my voice is, I think, if you talk about sort of gay voice or whatever, the sort of gay accent, it's sort of medium gay, I would say. I think it's, people aren't necessarily surprised to hear that I'm gay, but I don't necessarily always come off as gay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and that's a very complicated idea in the LGBT world, the idea of passing, and whether that's fundamentally better than not passing. And that's a whole other conversation.
Wow.
But there's this thing about, growing up, I had a much more even voice, probably pitched a little lower, and I, my wrists are very stiff, and it's been interesting with singing. I have often, for many years, my voice has gotten tired really quickly. I mean, opera is, it requires a lot from your body and from your voice, but there's a thing about how you're not supposed to get tired. And I would do something and my voice would quickly get tired. And I've had this crazy realization recently, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it definitely relates, where I realized, my throat is kind of constantly just a little more on than like just a little more sort of, and there's this whole thing, if you think about the throat chakra or whatever, the idea of letting your voice out and expressing yourself, of course, the idea of those muscles sort of just being just like the sense of, I think when I talked about the barrier between my inside and my outside and the distance between them, this idea of having a feeling that sort of comes up to here and then, you sort of choke it back. So there's all that. And as I was realizing, I think maybe this is the reason that my voice gets tired faster than other singers, is that there's more muscular activity here that's holding this voice back. And so I kind of went, okay, well, what happens if I consciously release that as an exercise? Because because it's so much in me, in the really deep part of myself, that I have to really consciously do it. If I'm not thinking about it, it's not happening. And what happened when I did that, when I was speaking, is my voice instantly got about 25% gayer.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, and I was like, oh no, because like in the intro you read, I'm a reasonable modern gay. I mean, I have many gay friends. My work is very queer. I'm very out, and I have been since a young age. And I never thought of myself as having a big issue about that, but it's in the body, And so when I really release that, in order to be able to access the singing that I need to do, in order to have more fluidity with the singing and less sort of fighting against myself, what comes out is this sense of just a naturally slightly more sort of queer sounding accent. And that's just kind of, for me, a metaphor for the ways that we think we have come to terms with something, and then the body's still holding it in. And even the idea of just being able to sort of be gay in a certain kind of way. I mean, I don't know how much you were sort of in touch with the sort of different communities in the LGBT world, but like, there's a lot of toxic stuff about masculinity within, and, mask for mask, like no femmes, like I'm like, yeah, I'm gay and I'm proudly gay and I wear my little hot pants at the gay pride parade, but like, I'm the one with the big beard and the big muscles and the low voice. And I'm not that kind of gay. Like that whole thing, it's very much infiltrated into the world in a really deep way. And so, yeah, there is this thing about like, if you can sort of pass as, I'm not particularly masculine, but if you can pass as like sort of a medium masculinity, then there's an unacknowledged relationship to your sort of more sort of like stereotypically gay stuff. And in order to really come to terms with my full self, I have to look at that and embrace it.
Wow. There's so much thinking and processing. When we've grown up in a religious dynamic that lets us know that how we are is not okay. It's not acceptable. And we try and bend and contort and conform ourselves, even sometimes when we've managed to leave that oppressive religious group, we're still impacted. There's still residue there. How did your family accept you coming out?
Oh, this has been a long story, and I don't need to get into the whole thing, but it's an ongoing thing. They sort of confronted me about discovering some content on the computer, or The movies that I was renting at the time, because I rented, the way that I got into the world when I was a teenager was going to the video store when that was a thing, and renting every movie I could get my hands on, and just trying to understand the world through movies. And so, inevitably, I sort of ended up renting some gay stuff, and it was very much sort of love the sin or hate the sin thing. But there, so this is something, it's very difficult to parse and to sort of tease out the different strands of this, because I never felt the sense that I wasn't welcome in the house. But there is the thing about, no, we love you. Why don't you come home more? Call us more. Come back and live with us. We love you. But there's a sense of that is not even acknowledged, and certainly isn't conscious for them. And because of that, takes a long time for you to realize as a person is that, but the me that you're talking about isn't all of me, and that's very difficult in some ways. And I don't think this is really true. And for all the people who this has happened to, I'm sure that they would not agree with this, but in some ways it would be easier if it had been a total disowning or, a total cutoff, because then you have to come to terms with it. I think that in the long run, it wouldn't be easier, because that's a deep wound that you have to, but the messiness of this eternal sense of only love and only acceptance for part, is very challenging. Because, and it's still, and we, it's still evolving. Both my parents are still alive, and they live in Tennessee, and
oh my gosh.
Yeah, which is a whole other story, but so, so this is, it's an ongoing, and I have a number of queer siblings as well. There's a lot of queerness in the family, and some of my other siblings did some of the heavy lifting in terms of, because I was one of these people, as I said about flying under the radar, I was one of these people who just was happy to just sort of, that was known, but we didn't talk about it, and I was happy to just go elsewhere. I didn't want to be the warrior of the family, and so it's been the idea of, as I said, like if you have an idea of yourself as fundamentally unacceptable, you maybe aren't consciously aware of the ways that you're enabling other people to second that, and they're not either. And I think my parents are basically fundamentally loving people, and kind and generous. And then there's this other way that's flying beneath the line of awareness, as they talk about in Buddhism, that is, I think about it as like you're reading the Wikipedia page of someone's life, and you just don't click on those tabs, So, love and relationships, community, like sort of like anything that has to do with, I'm interested about your career. I'm interested in the artistic stuff. I'm interested in the food that you're eating and where you're living and where you're going to school. But we're not going to click on. And my parents have tried to reverse that in the last few years, but that's a really messy thing. The idea of like, the line that my parents used to say when I was younger was, well, people in that lifestyle aren't happy, and that's a very fraught statement and way of thinking. So it's complicated, but so is life.
Yes. Pardon me. And you, how long have you been married?
So I met my husband in 2008, and we got married in 2016. So we've been married however long that is, but we've been together almost 15 years. And it's, and I mean, so much of so much of my life is about sort of personal development and really digging into this stuff, because it's a personal interest, and also it has to do with my work, and a lot of that stuff, the space for that work wouldn't have been possible without this sort of space around me that our relationship and that he has worked to create. So that's been a huge part of this thing, is that even though it's my reading and my exploration and my sort of somatic work and therapy and all this stuff, it's the dynamic of the relationship and the idea that you truly can be loved and lovable no matter what is something that whenever I have a moment of realizing the truth of that, and of course you realize and you forget and you realize and you forget, it blows my mind every time, and I'm instantly aware of the just probably billions of people in the world who never understand that.
Mm.
And who never really know that there's a way that no matter what, your sort of fundamental being is okay. That's what the Book of My Shame is all about, and that's my sort of and that's something that and certainly a lot of fundamentalist religion, the fundamental that is being referred to is the idea that you're not basically okay. So that's a pretty deep thing, and it's difficult for people to realize because, of course, there are behaviors that are not okay. You can't treat me like that. Like you can't do that. You can't. There are ways that you're treating other people that aren't okay, or there are ways that you're treating yourself that you don't want to live like that. So it's difficult for people, especially if you're a fundamentalist and you think of things in black and white, to sort of accept this pluralist idea that it's both true that you are fundamentally lovable and fundamentally okay, and that there's always room for improvement, and that you're always trying to sort of massage and grow your external self and your relationship to yourself. That's difficult for someone who's believed in either or to come to terms with this sort of both and.
Exactly. And it does have so much to do with maturing, because when we are in a fundamentalist thinking state, that's not a mature state, because we can't see any nuance or understand any nuance. And that is how fundamentalist religions want to keep followers in that very childlike state where they just look to the authority all the time. But you and I and others who are watching and listening to this show, we have managed to mature and are finding our way out of that, so that we are more comfortable with the both and the shades of gray and the nuance, and recognizing that many things can be true at once. Yeah. And I think that's such a beautiful, expansive way to live. And I hope people find your story encouraging. Can you tell us a little bit, just before we go, what's going on for you right now? What are you working on these days?
You mean sort of personally, professionally, or all the above? Or
sure, all the above.
Well, yeah. So as I said, a real growth moment for me is coming back around to realizing there are ways to work with resistance and to work with difficulty and pain, and to go into them. And even in terms of, fitness and things like that, for many, many years, anything that has required my body to be uncomfortable has been kind of a no-go zone, because of the ways that my body was controlled and sort of manipulated as a child. Mm-hmm. And the way that my relationship to pain and was not under my control. And so discovering as an adult that there's a way for me to experience pain that isn't traumatizing, and when if you're going to exercise or if you're going to do any sort of mental or emotional exercise, it involves going into discomfort, and part of the growth period is, as you said about the permissiveness, is realizing that you can control, and you can, at a certain point in many people's lives who recover from this stuff, there's a time when you're like, I am going to take it under my control that I never put myself in a situation where I'm uncomfortable. And that's part of it. And that's it's an immature part, but it's essential to realize that you have that control and you can get out of any situation, even if it puts other people off or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I'm coming back around now after many years of this kind of work to realizing, no, I can actually, there's this book called The Tools that I've been reading, Phil Stutz. There's a Netflix movie about him.
Oh, yes.
Have you seen it? Yeah, it's great. I don't love the way the book's written, but the ideas in it are really interesting. And this idea about desiring pain in some way, not in a masochistic way, but in a way that as something, so that if you truly desire it and aren't always avoiding it, then you can get to the place you want to get. And that can be a very positive thing. It's something that I wouldn't have been ready to hear earlier in my life. But that's part of it, and part of it also is my developing relationship with a sense of the spiritual and a sense of the divine, and it really interacts with my work a lot. My next big project after the Book of My Shames is all about a relationship to that. And I think when you talk about maturity and there's this word that I learned in a book I was reading recently, which is schismogenesis.
Oh, wow.
I love this, and I love this word, and I wish more people knew it so I could drop it into conversation more, because it's this idea. It's an anthropological word, I think, originally. It's this idea of defining yourself based on what you are not. So, like, we're the hill people, and what we are fundamentally is not the lowland people. So they're like, it's Sparta and Athens. It's like they're the erudite, sort of flimmy, flammy ones, and we're the super strong masculine ones, because that's not what they are. And I think that there's a very, when people escape, I think about this a lot when I think about sort of fundamentalist atheists, who I know a lot of those people too, and a lot of people who reacting to this cult world that I came out of. I think it's a fundamentally immature way to be, to define yourself by, well, that's what those people that I grew up with were like, so I will never touch that. And it's a schismogenetic way of kind of living your life. And I think that as long as I won't touch something or inquire into something because it stinks of the world that I grew up in, I'm living in an immature way. Because I think that, the world of the divine and the world of spirituality is a fundamental part of the human experience. And as long as I allow those people that I grew up with to control my access to that by me not wanting to go there because of them, I'm, they're winning, kind of. And right. The trauma is living on in me, even though I think I create an illusion of control for myself. So I was saying to someone the other day, as I'm diving into this idea of discomfort and of accepting discomfort, and not only accepting discomfort, but seeing discomfort as a sort of signpost toward what I need to go to next. Like that's my sort of lodestar, is like, what's uncomfortable right now? What's the brave thing to do? How can I go into the thing that I don't like? It does reek a little bit of this whole sort of death to self thing, and whenever I find a moment that, but the essential difference is that it's me that's making the decision, truly me, not someone mandating it. And that it may sound like a small thing, because especially when you talk about the ways that trauma and these fundamentalist mindsets live on in the body, and you become the enactor of your own trauma, etc. But you have to but with me, I have to sort of trust that I know that and I'm aware of it. But some of these things, I get a bit uncomfortable when I realize, I'm coming around to, in my own authentic discovery of myself, some of these things that were an essential part of the way that people thought of things when I was a kid. But now I know, I can feel, I can intuit that I'm coming to a healthy relationship to that human thing, rather than someone having that discovery and then telling everyone else, this is the way you have to live your life, no matter where you're coming from.
Right.
And so it's a combination of those two things for me. That's really my inquiry right now, is finding a way to even in this book I was reading, the tools, which is, I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everyone, because, as I said, it's the thing that I didn't like about it was that it's he has a bit of, when he talks about it, other guy who writes it, not Phil Stutz, the other guy who writes it, there's a bit of a sense of, this is the only way.
Oh yeah.
And as a fundamentalist, that's a huge red flag for you when you read that. And so you have to take it with a big grain of salt, especially if you have fundamentalism in you, to be aware that this is not the only way, nothing is the only way. But if you have a bit of distance from that and you're interested in an idea, and you can kind of take it. But as I've been looking at this book, they talk a lot about higher forces, and about this idea that pain is sort of, difficulty in your life. And I'm not sure that I totally buy this, but it's been interesting exploring it and seeing what the fruits of it are, in a sort of, ye shall know them by their fruits kind of is this idea of that, I'm hesitant to say, everything happens for a reason, or God has a plan for you, or whatever. But this idea that the difficult thing is there in your life to sort of show you where you can expand next, and to expand the boundaries of what you're comfortable with, and therefore expand the boundaries of the possibility for richness in your life. So it's been so interesting for me, because I'm a very sensitive person. I'm a very avoidant person. It's been so interesting for me to realize that when I truly accept more discomfort in my life, and even accept this idea that the discomfort is not just something that I have to learn to tolerate, but something that I can embrace, and therefore get a sense that maybe the universe or whatever has sort of sent it my way for a reason, which is something I'm not saying that's what I believe, but it's something I'm exploring. it's been so interesting to realize experientially when I've been having that happen, how much the colors of the world around me become more rich. When you think, oh no, if I truly see, I mean, the idea, I don't know if I coined this, but I feel like I coined it, the idea of a house demon, which is our little puppy that was barking earlier. When she came to the house, we were living in a very happy, sort of cuddly world with our other dog during COVID, where everything was going just the way we want. And then when she showed up, she just turned everything upside down. And so I think of her as the embodiment of this idea of a house demon, which is the thing that is in your life that is sort of intransigent and totally only itself and totally just a wrench in all your gears. And that's the thing that sort of leads you, and coming to a relationship with her as a sort of embodiment of that concept, as this hilarious, very difficult, very loud personality that's just sticking itself right in the place I don't want it to stick itself. But when you come to the idea, come to terms with the house demon and have this little, then keep the evil, or not that she's evil, but keep that thing that you don't like in your mind and keep it as part of the community of your life, as opposed to trying to rid yourself of it, which is one of the essential things about fundamentalism, is this is good and this is bad, and we only do this and we never do this. Mm-hmm. And so as I come to terms with the idea of widening my scope of what's acceptable to the things that I don't like and keeping them in my worldview, and allowing that they exist, and not just only targeting myself toward trying to get rid of the things that make me uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. When I actually do that, the colors of the world explode, and my world is sort of 7D as opposed to just like one axis from like more desirable to less desirable.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes I wrestle with my demons, and sometimes we just snuggle.
Yeah.
Oh, this has just been so interesting, and I think inspiring. Thank you for sharing so candidly with us about your journey, and just for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Janice. These are my primary areas of nerdery. So
hooray! Well, I want to thank you, everyone who joined us today for this episode. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. I want to remind you can pick up your tickets for the conference on religious trauma, which will be happening in October. I'll have links in the show notes for that. And you can always go to my website, divorcing-religion.com, if you want to send me a note. Thanks, everyone, and take care. Thanks, Isaiah.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.